It's the gift that doesn't stop giving, these stories, isn't it? It keeps us busy anyway as journalists.
It certainly keeps us very busy too. There's no end of scenarios that you now need to be thinking through, because things that you would have thought, are not really worth thinking through are actually absolutely critical right now. And the big one of all will be on whether or not we go into something that's a 1930s-style tit-for-tat trade war, which we think is still relatively low probability, or if you end up with something that's a little bit less sinister but is more smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, this is the thing. We don't know what's going to happen next. But have you done any work on what tariffs on autos would actually mean for the US economy?
Well, you see the sorts of figures that are talked about where the US is, say, running a deficit of $130-ish billion in autos. The amount of jobs that are in that market, it's about half as many that, for example, are related to delivering goods or moving goods around in the US. It's a decent portion, about 3-ish% of everyone with a job. So it definitely is something that, if it goes that far, do you really believe that they would want to shoot themselves in the foot? But it's the exact same story with the other broader tariffs too, that we know that even in the supply chain that China sells to the US is itself the fourth biggest part of that supply chain. 1 in 5 jobs in the US these days depend on international trade.
And oddly enough, the value added is created mainly where? In the United States. It's in China where you may get the assembly, but that only adds a small amount of the value of a good.
Now, an extra complicating factor on top of all of this, we've done the scenarios on how much dependency there is of the US economy from China's demand and the other way around. And the US, it's about 0.9% of its economy is accounted for by China.
Directly, though?
Well, that's through all channels. We've looked through the World Input-Output database. So, and then you look at who else could be impacted if you were to see the supply chain that feeds into China, that going into the US, also being hit. And there's many countries in this region. But there's also the similar countries that would be able to directly sell to the US. But all of that analysis that we've done may end up completely irrelevant if actually all that happens is China sells more to other countries that's then repackaged and still ends up in the US. That would at least narrow the bilateral balance while at the same time not hurting US consumers.
Absolutely. Now, we heard from Jay Powell talking on Congress, taking questions. He mentioned that up till now there's no really any significant impact from the tariffs, but it is too early to say. I'm sure that he's looking at that, then also looking at, hey, what's my boss been saying about me and my independence?
Well, on the first point about it is too early, $50 billion of goods that has a 25% tariff, by our estimate, it's a sort of a rounding error even for, say, China's economic impact. It doesn't have a significant impact on the US, even on the CPI, for example. If you go further to a $200 billion, and maybe, who knows, maybe it gets doubled up again before the midterm elections to even more, maybe a $400 billion, getting a 10% tariff, you could argue, well, that's not too far off a sort of a move in exchange rates you can get over a year. But if it starts ratcheting up even more from there, I think this is as you say, the opposite of a gift that keeps on giving. It's something that you could see as a defining issue over the next several years, all the way through at least to 2020.
The problem is people reducing capex, people ultimately postponing investment decisions. This is where the real damage gets done.
I agree. It's also adding to the issue of country risk, that people would say, OK, let's treat this like a natural disaster risk, that actually you need to think about spreading out, if you're able to, where you produce, in case wherever it is you're choosing to produce suddenly comes into the firing line.